There is exactly one Raiders team in the history of this franchise that had to go through absolutely everybody to win it all. Not one great rival, not one signature win. Every single dynasty of its era, in order, on the way to the only trophy that mattered. By the time this story is over, you'll have watched this team survive a two-time defending champion twice in the same season, absorb the single worst beating of its year from a division rival, and then turn around and demolish that exact same team in the playoffs. And that's before it even got to the Super Bowl, where it ran into a team that had already lost 3 championships in a row and was about to make it 4. This is the story of the 1976 Oakland Raiders, a team that didn't back into a title. It hunted down every single team that had ever stood between the Raiders and a championship, in the same 12-week stretch, and beat every one of them. 3 different dynasties, 3 different eras. One team, in one season, closing the book on all of it, with a roster so loaded that 9 of its players and its own head coach would eventually end up in Canton. If deep Raiders history like this is what you come to this channel for, go ahead and subscribe now. There's a lot more of this coming. Let's get into it. The years of heartbreak. To understand why 1976 meant so much, you have to understand exactly how many times this team had gotten its heart ripped out first, and exactly who kept doing the breaking. This wasn't a franchise that lacked talent. Year after year, the Raiders were winning 10, 11, 12 games in the regular season, only to run into a buzzsaw in January. Starting in the early 1970s, the Raiders were one of the most talented rosters in football, and it didn't matter. In the 1973 season, Oakland beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in the divisional round to avenge the infamous immaculate reception loss from the year before, when a deflected Franco Harris catch had ended their season in the final seconds. That win only earned them a date with an even tougher opponent. The Miami Dolphins were the 2-time defending Super Bowl champions, fresh off the only perfect season in NFL history in 1972, and they beat Oakland in the AFC Championship game, 27-10. The next year, in 1974, the Raiders got their revenge on Miami directly, toppling the Dolphins 28-26 in the divisional round on a last-minute touchdown pass from Ken Stabler to running back Clarence Davis, a play still remembered today as the Sea of Hands game. It ended Miami's run as back-to-back Super Bowl champions right there on the field. And it still wasn't enough to get Oakland to the promised land. The Raiders lost the AFC Championship game that same year to the Pittsburgh Steelers, 24-13. And the Steelers went on to win their first Super Bowl behind the Steel Curtain defense that was quickly becoming the standard for the entire decade. In 1975, it happened again, almost beat for beat. Oakland reached the AFC Championship game for the 3rd year in a row and lost to Pittsburgh for the 2nd year in a row, 16-10, as the Steelers went on to win back-to-back titles of their own. 3 straight seasons, 3 straight AFC Championship game losses to the 2 toughest teams in football at the time. Miami's Dolphins had Bob Grease, Larry Csonka, and a defense nicknamed the No-Name Defense that had just finished the only perfect season in NFL history. Pittsburgh Steelers had Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, and a front 4, Joe Green, L.C. Greenwood, Ernie Holmes, and Dwight White, that the entire league had started calling the Steel Curtain. Head coach John Madden was already being second-guessed publicly as a coach who simply couldn't win the biggest game of the year. Every single dynasty of the decade had taken its turn ending Oakland's season, sometimes more than once. Nobody outside the Raiders' own locker room expected 1976 to be any different. The comeback that started it all. The 1976 season opened on September 12th with the cruelest possible draw, Oakland hosting the same Pittsburgh Steelers team that had eliminated them each of the previous 2 years, now gunning for a 3rd straight championship of its own. For most of the afternoon, it looked like more of the same. The Raiders fell behind 28-14 with just over 5 minutes to play, and a fan base that had already watched this exact script play out twice before had every reason to expect a 3rd heartbreak against the exact same opponent. Instead, Oakland scored twice in the final minutes to tie the game, and with 18 seconds left, kicker Fred Steinfort drilled a 21-yard field goal to win it, 31-28. Fans still call it the comeback classic. It was the first time in 3 years the Raiders had beaten Pittsburgh when it actually counted, and it happened on opening day, in front of their own crowd, against the team that had haunted their last 2 Januaries. Oakland wouldn't lose again for months, except for one game. A roster of characters before we get to the games themselves. It's worth knowing exactly who was doing all this winning, because this Raiders team was as colorful off the field as it was dominant on it. Linebacker Ted Hendricks, listed at 6'7" and built like a scarecrow, played the position like nobody else in football, and earned the nickname the Mad Stork for his gangly, unorthodox style. He'd go on to block more kicks than almost any player in NFL history. Defensive end Otis Sistrunk became a piece of Monday Night Football folklore in the mid-1970s, when broadcaster Alex Karras, noticing Sistrunk had no college listed in the program, joked on air that he must have attended the University of Mars. Safety Jack Tatum hit so hard and so often that opponents simply called him the Assassin, and defensive end John Matusak, a former first overall draft pick nicknamed Twos, was as famous around the Bay Area for his nightlife as he was for his pass rush. This was the exact kind of roster Al Davis had built his entire organization around: misfits, cast-offs, and larger-than-life personalities that other franchises weren't sure what to do with, wrapped around a genuine core of future Hall of Famers. In 1976, all of it finally clicked at the same time, on both sides of the ball, for an entire 16-week stretch. The one loss 3 weeks later, on October 3rd, the Raiders traveled to face the New England Patriots and were annihilated, 48-17. New England piled up 296 rushing yards and simply overwhelmed Oakland at the line of scrimmage all afternoon. The Boston Globe ran a photo of the scoreboard the next morning under the headline, "That Says It All." It remains, to this day, the only loss the 1976 Raiders suffered all season, regular season or playoffs, and it wasn't remotely close. Oakland shook it off completely. The Raiders reeled off 6 straight wins after the New England loss, including a white-knuckle 28-27 escape at Chicago where the Bears had a shot to win it late, and a pair of hard-fought wins over Denver that clinched yet another AFC West title. They closed out the regular season at 13-1, including a 49-16 blowout of the expansion Tampa Bay Buccaneers and a 24-0 shutout of the San Diego Chargers in the finale. Ken Stabler threw 27 touchdowns against only 17 interceptions and completed 2/3 of his passes, finishing 3rd in league MVP voting. Cliff Branch led the NFL with 1,111 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns. Mark Van Egan ran for over 1,000 yards out of the backfield. This was, by any measure, one of the most complete rosters in the NFL, and it was headed straight back into the exact same gauntlet that had broken its heart 3 years running. Revenge. Twice the divisional round brought New England back to Oakland, the same team that had blown the Raiders out by 31 points just 11 weeks earlier. This time, the two teams played a tight physical battle that came down to the final minute. Trailing late, Stabler dropped back on a pass that fell incomplete, but referee Ben Drythe threw a flag anyway, calling Patriots defensive tackle Ray Sugar Bear Hamilton for roughing the passer with under 90 seconds left. The penalty kept Oakland's drive alive, and the Raiders scored the go-ahead touchdown moments later to win it, 24-21. Patriots fans still dispute that call to this day. It's remembered in New England in the same breath as the Tuck Rule game the two franchises would play a quarter-century later. Except this time, the disputed call broke in the Raiders' favor. Then came the AFC Championship game, played on December 26th, and the opponent Oakland fans had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, the Pittsburgh Steelers, for the 3rd year in a row. This was the team that had ended Oakland's season in 1974. The team that had ended it again in 1975. The two-time defending Super Bowl champions, standing between the Raiders and the title for a 4th straight year. This time playing without both of their starting running backs, Franco Harris and Rocky Bleier, due to injury. Oakland didn't just beat them, it dismantled them, 24-7, leaning almost entirely on the ground game and holding Pittsburgh's own vaunted rushing attack to just 72 yards on the day, a near-total shutdown of the Steel Curtain's own identity. The 3-year nightmare was over. For the first time in franchise history, the Raiders were headed to the Super Bowl as conference champions instead of conference runners-up. We're deep into this one, and every team that had haunted this franchise for years is already behind them. If a story like this is the kind of thing you want more of from this channel, go ahead and hit like right now. It costs 2 seconds, and it's genuinely what tells YouTube to put Raiders history in front of more people who'd enjoy it. One powerhouse still remained: the weight on Madden and Davis. Before we get to the Super Bowl itself, it's worth pausing on what this moment actually meant for the two men running the organization. John Madden had been the Raiders' head coach since 1969, and by the start of 1976, he already owned one of the best winning percentages of any coach in NFL history. And none of it mattered to his critics, because he hadn't been able to get his team past Miami or Pittsburgh when the season was on the line. 3 straight conference title losses will do that to a coach's reputation, fair or not. Al Davis, the team's principal owner and the man who'd built this roster piece by piece out of players other franchises didn't want, was carrying the exact same weight. Both men had built something clearly great. Both men needed the rest of football to actually see it. That's part of why the AFC Championship win over Pittsburgh mattered every bit as much as the Super Bowl itself inside that locker room. Beating Pittsburgh wasn't just advancing to the next round. It was erasing 2 years of a very specific, very public narrative about a coach and an organization that supposedly couldn't finish the job, built by a front office that had staked its entire identity on proving conventional scouting wrong. Super Bowl Z. Waiting in Super Bowl XI, on January 9, 1977, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, were the Minnesota Vikings, the NFC's own answer to Oakland's years of frustration. Led by quarterback Fran Tarkenton, the Vikings were making their 4th Super Bowl appearance in 8 years, having already lost all 3 of the previous ones. If any team represented Powerhouse that simply couldn't be kept out of the championship conversation, it was Minnesota. Vikings coach Bud Grant had built a perennial contender out of a brutal, physical defense, and by 1977 the football world had started to wonder, only half-jokingly, whether the Vikings were simply cursed on the sport's biggest stage. Oakland was about to make that question look understated. It wasn't close from the start. Oakland's offensive line, nicknamed the Elephants for their sheer size, bulldozed the Minnesota front all afternoon. The Raiders drove 90 yards on their opening possession before settling for a field goal, then took a 16-0 lead into halftime behind a Pete Banaszak touchdown run and another Errol Mann field goal. Minnesota's defense had no answer for Oakland's ground game, and when linebacker Phil Villapiano tipped a Tarkenton pass in the second quarter, linebacker Willie Hall picked it off. Setting up another short field, the Raiders quickly converted. Running back Clarence Davis, the same man who delivered the Sea of Hands touchdown 2 years earlier, tore through the Vikings defense for 137 yards on just 16 carries, a Super Bowl rushing record at the time. Fred Biletnikoff caught only 4 passes for 79 yards and never found the end zone himself. But every one of those catches set up an Oakland score, including a 48-yard grab that set up Banaszak's second touchdown of the day. Biletnikoff was named the game's most valuable player anyway, only the second wide receiver in Super Bowl history to win the award, and to this day the only one to do it without reaching 100 receiving yards. Minnesota briefly threatened in the third quarter, driving to the Oakland 3-yard line, before running back Brent McClanahan fumbled after being hit by Villapiano, and Willie Hall recovered it to snuff out the scoring chance completely, the closest the Vikings would come to genuinely threatening all afternoon. Tarkenton spent the rest of the game under constant pressure and never found any rhythm, finishing 17 of 35 for 205 yards with 2 interceptions and no touchdown passes of his own. In the fourth quarter, with Minnesota still trying to claw back into it, cornerback Willie Brown stepped in front of a Tarkenton pass intended for Sammy White and returned it 75 yards for a touchdown, a Super Bowl record for the longest interception return that stood for 16 years. Until Super Bowl 25. Oakland finished with 429 total yards, a Super Bowl record at the time, including 288 yards in the first half alone. Final score, 32-14. The Raiders had their first championship in 17 seasons of trying. Across their 4 Super Bowl appearances, the Vikings were outscored by a combined 95-34 and managed barely 55 rushing yards a game. Oakland hadn't just beaten a powerhouse, it had beaten the single most snake-bitten powerhouse in Super Bowl history, and made it look easy in the process. As the final seconds ticked away, John Madden was lifted onto his players' shoulders on the Rose Bowl turf. The same coach who'd spent 3 straight Januaries being asked what was wrong with his team, carried off the field by the men who'd just answered that question for good. The most decorated roster of its era. Add it all up, and this Raiders team beat the 2-time defending champion Steelers twice in the same season, avenged its only loss of the year against New England in the playoffs, and then dismantled a Vikings team playing in its 4th Super Bowl. It is difficult to find a championship run in NFL history that ran through more accumulated championship pedigree in a single stretch. 3 different dynasties, 3 different conferences worth of frustration, all cleared in the span of about 16 weeks. Most champions get to pick their poison along the way, catching a break in a weaker bracket or an injury to a rival. This Raiders team got no such break. Every team standing in front of them had already won, or was about to. It also explains why this particular roster is so loaded with legends. Ken Stabler, Fred Biletnikoff, Dave Casper, Cliff Branch, Willie Brown, Ted Hendricks, Ray Guy, Art Shell, and Gene Upshaw are all enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, alongside head coach John Madden himself. 9 players and a coach from a single championship roster, all with busts in Canton. Shell and Upshaw anchored the left side of that offensive line together for over a decade and are still remembered as one of the great tackle-guard tandems in league history. Ray Guy remains the only pure punter ever inducted into the Hall of Fame, a distinction that traces directly back to seasons like this one, where his ability to flip field position quietly won games nobody credited him for. In 2012, NFL.com ran a 64-team fan-voted bracket to determine the single greatest team in league history, pitting decades of champions against each other. The 1976 Raiders won the entire thing, edging the 2000 Baltimore Ravens in the final by less than 1 percentage point of the vote. 3 years of heartbreak. 2 revenge wins over the same two-time champion in a single season. 1 record-setting demolition of a 4-time Super Bowl loser. This is the season that finally answered every doubt about this Raiders team, by beating literally everyone who'd ever stood in its way. 3 seasons of losing the exact same game to the exact same 2 dynasties. Then, in the span of about 4 months, this team beat both of them. Plus the team that had embarrassed them worse than anyone else that year. Plus the NFC's own version of a snake-bitten powerhouse. And did it all with a roster that would eventually send 9 players and a head coach to Canton. That's not a lucky championship run. That's a team that had to go through literally every obstacle the NFL could put in front of it, in order, and cleared every single one, on the road and at home, in blowouts and in games decided by a single controversial flag. There's a reason football historians still argue about whether any single-season run has ever cleared a tougher gauntlet than this one, and there's a reason a fan vote decades later crowned this exact roster as the greatest team professional football has ever produced. So tell me in the comments, did you know the Raiders had lost 3 straight AFC title games before finally breaking through in 1976? Or is the Willie Brown pick 6, or the Ray Hamilton roughing call, the piece of this story you already knew by heart? If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with a fellow Raiders fan who'd want the full story. Every one of those actions is what tells YouTube to keep putting this channel in front of more people who care about this era of football as much as you do. I'll see you in the next one.